I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. Oh. Thank you very much. And I'm so pleased that so many of you are able to join us in person tonight. And also I want to express our gratitude to our online audience. Anyway, we're delighted to welcome both groups to this special talk this evening. This lecture is part of the Labor, Literature and Landmark lecture series. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I want to express our appreciation to them for their promotional support of this talk. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, and apologies to you, many of you who've heard this before, a brief background to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. We were founded in 1785. 237 years ago by 22 artisans. Since that time, the Society continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our various educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Museum, and for our audience in person, you're very welcome to explore the Lock Museum later this evening, and our library, which celebrated 200 years fairly recently, and of course of which tonight's lecture is taking part. And finally, our lecture series, of course, of which tonight is also part of. And of course, our lecture series has a long tradition and was started in 1837. For our online audience, please feel free to submit typed questions at any point during the lecture. We ask that you use the Q&A component rather than raising your hand. For our in-person audience, we'll ask that you hold off questions until the very end. It is a great pleasure for the General Society to welcome back tonight author and artist Adam Van Doren to speak this evening about his book, In the Founder Footsteps, Landmarks of the American Revolution. And I want to point out that this book is for sale tonight and can also be purchased for the online audience through the Godine Publishing website. It's absolutely magnificent. I don't know if I'm going to be, the camera will be on the book, and of course I'm turning that, but just like beautiful illustrations you're going to see in this lecture. And really what a wonderful memento of, I know, of what's going to be a really fascinating lecture. Adam Van Doren received his master's degree at Columbia University and has been a visiting artist at the American Academy in Rome. He teaches at Yale University, where he is also an associate fellow and is exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., among other institutions. His work is included in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, the Wadsworth Atheneum, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. I think I might have skipped the line where I said he teaches art at Yale University. Did I skip that?
No, I think you got that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to reinforce that Adam teaches art at Yale University. He's the author of a number of books: The House That Tells the Story, Homes of the American Presidents, The Stones of Yale, a book that he spoke about on his last visit here, and finally, An Artist in Venice. I'm so pleased to introduce to you tonight Adam Van Doren. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was a wonderful introduction. Puts a little pressure on me to do a good job. But I want to thank her for arranging this and for so many of you to come out, and for those online, wherever you are, in outer space. This is a wonderful institution, and I can't think of a better place to give a talk like this, considering right side in the hallway, I assume many of you know there's a bas relief of George Washington commemorating his something or other birthday, or what is it? Okay, put up many years ago. I would like to say that I think what I would enjoy doing is going through a number of images from the book. It's a combination of watercolor paintings that I did of these historic landmarks and essays that I wrote about each one. But we don't have time to, of course, cover all of it, and then you wouldn't buy the book. So, but I will give little thumbnail descriptions to go with the images, and then I'm going to read a passage of one of the essays to get a flavor of the writing. It's actually an excerpted version of one of the essays. And then I'd be glad to answer any questions. So, and of course, I'll sign some books. A brief intro to how I came about doing this book. I had done a book, as was mentioned, on the homes of the American presidents. And I went around the country and did paintings and essays on that subject matter as well. Not all 43 presidents or 45, whatever I had at the time, but I limited it to a few. I worked with the historian David McCullough, who's a great collaborator and friend, and we did that. And as I did some portraits and essays about some of the colonial era presidential homes, I got inspired to do a larger subject for a new book, which is what we have today. I can say that there's nothing more exciting in history than actually going to the places, as much as it's also exciting to read the book, I presume. But for me to visit these sites, places like some of which you may have been to, Clipton Manor outside of Germantown, to stand on the very steps of the house where rebel soldiers died during a very, unfortunately, a very serious defeat against the British, who were all in this constant battle to regain Philadelphia at the time. But to hold the same banister, Thomas Jefferson's staircase in his house, or John Adams's house, or also bumping your head, as I frequently did in some of the smaller colonial homes with the very low ceilings, specifically one house in Staten Island, where John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and Edward Rutledge came to meet General Howe in the early days of the Revolution, hoping for a negotiation that never happened, and the war, of course, continued. But to be at these places is thrilling, and there's really no substitute. I chose 30 sites in all, roughly, maybe more, trying to do a combination of sites that may be a little bit more well-known for those who are not as familiar with American history, perhaps, and the other half for those who might be a little bit more familiar, and amateur historians or maybe professional historians who might want to learn something. That was kind of the motive in thinking about my list. It was hard to break it all down, but I did. There are some in the back which are noted more in brief because it was too hard to fill in 35 essays in one book. I must say at one point I thought, what did I get myself into? Because to do presidential homes is one thing from somebody who's trying to learn about a period or a house, but to take on the American Revolution based on a few courses I'd taken in high school and college was daunting. And I thought, this is nuts. Leave that to David McCullough. But as I went into it more, I realized this is a personal take. I'm not redoing Henry Steele Commanger's books or Rick Atkinson, if you know his recent works. I'm going to do a personal history. I also thought, well, not all of history is about war and battles and generals and winter encampments at Valley Forge. A lot of it is art and culture too, which I'm perhaps a little bit more familiar with. So I chose at certain intervals when I could to give samples of that too. I mentioned on one of the sites an opportunity to see the portrait of Benjamin Rush at the National Portrait Gallery, a great founding father, or visiting the house of Gilbert Stuart in Rhode Island, who of course painted so many of the founding fathers. So that gave me the impetus to take this on, which I did. And just a couple of notes before we look at the slides. It was very interesting to learn, very apropos, this lecture, to learn how many of these sites existed in New York City and how much of the revolution took place here. There's Francis's Tavern, a replica, but I don't think George Washington will be able to notice the difference. If some of you have been there, it's a very good replica done in the 1900s. You've got the spot where George Washington read the Declaration of Independence to his troops near City Hall. There's a marker on the ground. You've got some of the forts further uptown and closer by, the Battle of White Plains. There's plaques at near Columbia University where the Battle of Harlem Heights took place. You have St. Paul's Chapel, where Washington worshipped while he was president, just after the Revolution. There was a pew known as Washington's Pew for a long time, and countless others, which I'm just forgetting. Oh, well, I was just apropos Washington. I don't think a lot of people realize that he lived in Manhattan for 2 years as president, a house on Cherry Street, which was the first so-called White House, long since demolished. And as I went into this, of course, I also explored some of the less savory aspects of the founding fathers, slavery of being a paramount, no doubt, but even delving into some of their own selfish, if you will, motives for, in the case of Washington, already looking at land speculation in the West and what was then Ohio, or what is now Ohio, if they were successful in winning the revolution. So it wasn't all lofty interests, but I touched on those, but I also stood back a little bit by going too far into it, because that's not really the tone of the book, and my publisher and I talked about that. But I do mention it when I feel it's appropriate, and it is important not to just make it all rosy. So let's go into these images. And as I say, then I'll read a little, and I'll be happy to answer questions. So if I can get the magic wand. That, of course, is the cover. And this is just very briefly, it's too hard to see from here. It's a map that's included in the book of the many historical sites that I visited and mentioned in the book. This is a building at Colonial Williamsburg, which is, all these places are extant. You can visit any of these. This is by no means a Disneyland place for children. I'm sure some of you have been. It's an extraordinary living museum, if you will. And what I always remember in the couple of times I've been is the erudition of the actors who portray these various figures in the founding fathers. They never break out of character. They never come up to a little kid and say, "Oh, aren't you cute? You want a little ice cream?" No, they always remain committed to the purpose of the place as an educational village, if you will, a restoration of Colonial Williamsburg. Took billions and billions of dollars in today's money. The Rockefellers put up most of it to convert this rundown area into this extraordinary place. This is a map showing a little lesser known story of the revolution. Benedict Arnold was, believe it or not, one of, if not Washington's favorite general before he defected. And just before the Declaration of Independence was signed, Washington engaged him to take about 1,000 men to Quebec to take on a British fort there. It was a horrific journey that only half survived. They were eating their dogs and God knows what else. It took a lot longer. You know, this was uncharted area. This was the area around Maine woods, and they really didn't know what they were getting into. And when they finally got there too late, at least for the weather, it was wintry, the men froze and the British were already stockaded in the nice fort, and it was a hopeless battle. One of the generals, Robert Montgomery, has a beautiful plaque in St. Paul's Chapel. He died in that war. I'm sorry, that battle. Let's go back one. This, of course, is, I'm sure many of you recognize Paul Revere's statue in Boston. Paul Revere, interestingly enough, was not that well known a few decades after he died. He is now known largely because of Longfellow's poem that every child knows, right? He had certainly a name as a silversmith. and was a great contributor to many causes of the revolution, but he wasn't the only writer to call out that the redcoats were coming. Others had done that, but he fit the certain rhyming pattern of Longfellow in that famous poem, and he is forever immortalized. This is a lesser known building to some. It's tucked behind Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Carpenter's Hall. And this is where the first Continental Congress met before they moved into Independence Hall. It's a gorgeous building, beautifully proportioned. Just doesn't have the name recognition, although it's right there in Independence Park, now so-called a national park. The founding fathers met on the first floor and they closed the shutters while they met so that the British officers that were roaming around wouldn't hear what they were conspiring about. I also included some images, so it wouldn't all be buildings, of some figures, in this case, some of the soldiers of the Battle of Brooklyn. This is the house I briefly mentioned on Staten Island, where Adams and Franklin came to meet General Howe. Howe offered them shortly after the Declaration of Independence was signed. He said, look, let's pretend this never happened. You can all go home. No one's going to be executed for treason, but you're not going to win this war. The British had trounced them at the Battle of Brooklyn shortly before that. But these three emissaries from the Continental Congress were steadfast, and they said, no, we are committed. We signed the Declaration. You burned our houses. You should be the one that's going anyway. So it didn't turn out to be successful, and the war continued. But that house is a wonderful little visit way into Staten Island. So it's quite a trip. Oops. One more. This is an image, of course, of Independence Hall. I did two, one for the cover of the book, but I didn't want to repeat it on the inside, so I did another version on white paper. The other one is done on a creamier paper using white gouache for those who are artists. This is a painting I did of Nassau Hall at Princeton, which is still there, of course. This was the largest building in the colonies when it was built. It was then known as the College of New Jersey. And the British set up a garrison in this building, and the walls are tremendously thick. The attempts to hit it with artillery failed. The one success was that the Americans did eventually win that battle. It wasn't a large battle. But Alexander Hamilton's artillery shot a cannon through one of the windows. And apparently it hit a portrait of George III and it collapsed to the ground. So that's in many of the history books, though no one knows for sure. This is the house that John Adams lived in for many years in Quincy, Mass. It was then called Braintree. It doesn't have the acreage that it once had, but the house is very much intact and very well worth a visit, partly because, unlike many other houses that I visited, or I'm sure you have in your travels, the furniture isn't always the original. They've come up with replicas. The Adams family lived in this for several generations. There are many Adams descendants that are well known: Charles Francis Adams, Henry Adams, and a great granddaughter who wrote a book that I use as a reference. But they kept all the effects just as Abigail and John had them. So it's really very important from that perspective. This is a scene of an epic journey that a group of soldiers on the Patriot side went to gather 26 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to bring back to Boston to fend off the British. It was extraordinary in those days for what they had to endure to take these heavy bits of artillery. Now you'd put it on van lines, trucking, and it would take you about 12 hours. Then it took several weeks. They broke them up into pieces, as you can see here, disassembled them and dragged them through the snow. But they effectively got them to Dorchester Heights. And when the British saw these cannons, they said they have no chance, and the ships left. I should note that one of the remarkable things that I touched on in the book is one of the great enigmas is how these founding fathers ever even decided they should take on this war when they were at such underdogs, to put it mildly. They had no navy at all. John Paul Jones would later just have one ship, but you're dealing with a group of colonists that don't really have a great army to speak of, and the British are the largest army in the world. And on that day that they signed the Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers who did that in Philadelphia knew full well that in New York Harbor, there were over 30,000 British and well over 7,500 battleships sitting in New York Harbor. So they pledged their lives, in many cases, very prosperous lives, and they were risking everything. I mean, Thomas Jefferson had 10,000 acres. He was only 33 years old. Washington, others, Madison had a beautiful estate. So it's quite remarkable that they stuck to this. This is Clipton Manor, as I mentioned, in Germantown, where it was a back and forth to take Philadelphia, a wonderful historical site you can visit outside of Philly. This is Valley Forge, as you might guess. I'm going to read a little bit of an essay I did about that. This is an interesting story. This is of the British spy who was captured by the American militia, just 3 men, really, on a watch post in Tappan, New York. How many people know the name Major John Andre? A few. Yeah, he's quite a story. He was a very sophisticated bon vivant in Britain, a young, dashing fellow who was also artistic. He got himself into this mess by conspiring with Benedict Arnold. At the time, they didn't know Benedict Arnold was switching sides, but he was caught, Andre, in Tappan, on a lone roadway where these 3 men noticed him and asked him to stop. And they, in the old days, they wouldn't have called it frisking, but whatever they did to see if he had anything on him. And after a little bit, they said, oh, just let him go after he took off his coat. But one of them said, wait a minute, check his boots. And that was the fateful moment when in his boots, he had the plans to West Point, which was then a fort, wasn't a military academy, which Benedict Arnold had given to him, which laid out the whole scheme of that important strategic outpost. And so he was sentenced to be executed. And on the very day of his execution, this little village in upstate Westchester, really, you can go visit, he made a drawing of himself in pen and ink, how he had the stomach to make a sketch. And he wanted to make himself look dignified. I did a watercolor of the sketch. It's actually fairly accurate, I must say. But a couple more pieces to the story is I discovered that the Yale University Art Museum has the actual sketch, which you don't have to be affiliated with Yale to go to that museum. And they will bring it out. You know, you got to give them a day's notice or something. And there you unfold this piece of paper, which is only about this big. Somehow, I think he gave it to a guard before he went off to be executed. Somehow these things are saved, right? So to hold that in your hands is quite special. And then the final bit of the story is 40 years after he was buried in Tappan, King George III, who was still king, requested that his body be exhumed. And by then nobody cared on the American side. And he was buried as a martyr in Westminster Abbey. And you can see a beautiful monument to him if you go to London. This is apropos West Point. It's an interesting artifact. Washington and his crew devised a way to come up with a chain that would go across the Hudson to keep the British from moving up and down, having their way in the center of the Hudson River with their ships. And this great chain, again, if you did this today, it would be no big deal, right? You go to a forge somewhere in Pennsylvania and you'd build this in a second. But back then it was an unbelievable task. They didn't really have big forges. They had local blacksmiths, you know. The Europeans had all that stuff. So they built this, and these are a few of the original chain links that are still in existence, and they were made into this memorial at West Point. This is an attempt to bring to life Benjamin Franklin. His house is no longer in existence in Philadelphia, long since torn down. But there is the old print shop, which he started, and you can still go into the place where he had his little business, and you can see people doing the old style printing that he would have done. This is a statue to Thomas Payne, in all places, New Rochelle, New York, where Dick Van Dyke also lived. Thomas Paine deserves to be a founding father. His role in the American Revolution is extraordinary. His book, Common Sense, I'm sure some of you have heard, is probably one of the greatest stories in publishing history. 350,000 copies were sold, whatever it cost. But then you think how many people lived in the colonies at that time. And he spoke with a fervor and a poetry about the cause. Nothing he said was original, but he said it in such a way that resonated with all walks of class and status and wealth in the colonies. He didn't reference Aristotle and Locke as Adams or Jefferson would. He spoke to the common man, if you will, but his metaphors, I'm sure some of you know them, are very memorable. And he ended up writing 2 more books, The Rights of Man and The American Crises. So his role was instrumental in gathering support for the revolution. This is a scene in the swamps of Georgia and South Carolina, where a large portion of the Revolutionary War was fought. People don't realize that almost as many battles happened in the South as they did in the North. They're not quite as famous, maybe not as big, but basically the British had reached a stalemate in the first half of the war. I'm simplifying things slightly, but they decided to go to the South where they thought they would have more loyalist followers and take some of those cities, which they did back and forth. But ultimately, of course, it failed, certainly at Yorktown, the ultimate failure in Virginia. But in these swamps was a group of sort of Robin Hood-like figures on the Patriot side, led by Francis Marion, who was a legendary figure, not legendary, I mean, he's a real person, but I should say he's not mythical, he's certainly legendary. He was well known up until even the 1950s. Name recognition was so good for him that Walt Disney did a TV series about him. I don't think his name is known as well today, but he hung back in the swamps where the British had no way of getting in there or knowing how to maneuver. And they would come out like guerrillas or terrorists and knock off the British out there were marching, and they created such havoc that they really wore down the British in those areas. This is, as you might guess, Mount Vernon. Since I did a in-depth essay and paintings in my book on presidential homes, I chose here to do the gardens of Mount Vernon. So you can read about those in the book. This is St. Paul's Chapel, which I alluded to downtown, where Washington worshiped. Also, he sat in on the first commencement of Columbia College. It was then King's College before the Revolution, but then it became Columbia, and he saw the first graduating class. It's probably only 25 students. This is a sculpture of Lafayette, another deserving founding father, although he was French. His role in the revolution was extraordinary. His push to get the French to join the alliance and help the Americans with money and soldiers and generals was crucial. Beloved by George Washington. Some say he was the son he never had. They were extremely close. He also spoke very much against slavery and tried to get Washington to think of giving up his slaves. Whereas you might say some of the French had ulterior motives to join the cause because they despised the British so much. This man was purely interested in the idea of democracy and freedom, and he's a great figure. The last bit of note on him that I want to mention, he came back 50 years after the revolution as a founding son, if you will, of the cause. And he came back from France, and they had a victory parade that lasted, not parade, but a series of events and galas that lasted almost 2 years. He went to every single state in the country, and there were lines. It was the equivalent of Beatlemania back then. He was so revered. So he's worth a study on his own. This is a little, not so little, but smaller house than Monticello that Jefferson built as a weekend getaway from his house in Monticello. He had become such a celebrity after the revolution, and then of course later president, the people come up and knock on his French doors and bother him and want to get the equivalent of an autograph, I suppose, or just see what he looked like. And so he would escape to a house he built very similar. It's kind of a mini version of Monticello, a very beautiful building called Poplar Forest in Virginia. This is a house in Wethersfield, Connecticut, outside of Philadelphia, where a lot of beautiful colonial homes are. The importance of this structure is this is where General Washington met with the French General Rochambeau in the later part of the war to plan the attack on Yorktown. Washington very much had a bee in his bonnet that he wanted to go back and take back New York City, which the British had occupied for all of the 7, 8 years of the war. And after the Battle of Brooklyn's loss, Washington really felt he wanted to take it back, but Rochambeau convinced them he wouldn't be successful and that Yorktown would be where they should go. And of course, that was a good choice. This is Rochambeau, a statue of him that I did a late afternoon, a painting of this statue in Newport, where Rochambeau and his French a group of ships landed for 6 months in waiting until Washington got them to join and plan this campaign at Yorktown. This is Yorktown battlefield, looking a little more picturesque than I'm sure the soldiers would have remembered it. This is a building that's the Maryland State House, and its importance in Annapolis, its importance is that this is where George Washington resigned his general's commission after the war. And it sounds like paperwork, which it was, and it sounds about as sexy as getting a new driver's license. But the significance of that was major. This was somebody who was really a deity by the end of the war, and he could have well, believe it or not, become king. As bizarre as that sounds, there were certain founding fathers who wanted to make him king. He would have none of it, and like Cincinnatus in ancient Rome, he wanted to go back to his farm, which he did, until he was, of course, called back. But there's a statue of him there in the room where he resigned his commission. To a slide while I read this passage, so you'll have it up, if I can find it now. All right. Winter of Discontent, Valley Forge Historic Site. If you Google George Washington at Valley Forge, chances are you'll come across a picture by Arnold Freeberg, painted in 1975. It shows Washington kneeling alone in the snow, his hands clasped in prayer. Washington was a deeply religious man, and it's possible he did in fact pray. He certainly had reason to. Some 2,000 of his men had died that winter and early spring of 1777 to 78, many from disease or starvation in what became a horrific 6 months. On February 16th, 1778, in the midst of the crisis, the general wrote to Governor Clinton of New York, "For some days past, there has been little less than a famine in camp. A part of the army has been weak without any kind of flesh and rest for 3 or 4 days. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery." Washington pleaded with Congress for more supplies, but received little for his pains. Congress was hampered by scarcity of money, failure of credit, and an inefficient administrative system mired in bureaucratic wrangling. Meanwhile, Washington's army was reeling from a string of defeats in Pennsylvania during the spring of 1777 at Paoli, Brandywine, and Germantown. Each had been an attempt to win back Philadelphia. Washington could no longer afford to wait for Congress to act. He tried instead to purchase food from the locals around Valley Forge, but met with resistance. Farmers would rather sell to the English, whose currency was more valuable. Furthermore, some of these farmers were reluctant because of their loyalist leanings. Why support a fight against people who had the same language, religion, and customs? Pennsylvania, like New York and most of the South, had a sizable population that sided with the crown. In desperation, Washington was forced to confiscate food supplies from the neighboring residents, something he felt morally opposed to. Given these hardships at Valley Forge then, how did the Continental Army stay together? And how did the men continue to fight? In the fall of 2019, I set out to find some answers. Traveling by car, I headed out of New York City toward Valley Forge National Park. The address on my navigation system read 1400 North Outer Line Drive, King of Prussia, PA. I took I-95 south through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. For much of the drive, the only scenery seemed to be numbing stretches of smokestacks and oil storage tanks. The interstate was bumper to bumper, fumes were sickening. When I finally got near the park, I was confronted with shopping malls and high-rise developments. This wasn't exactly what I expected from my scenic tour. Things changed, however, as soon as I passed through the gates of Valley Forge. White lawns and exit ramps gave way to the beauty of open fields, mature trees, and stone walls. Wooden fence posts lined the narrow, curving roads. I arrived at the visitor center and made a beeline for the reception desk. I was told to contact Park Ranger Bill Trotman, who had been assigned to give me a private tour at 3 o'clock. The office assistant wrote down his cell number for me, and I called him. "I'm running a little late," Bill said. "I was just firing muskets near one of the cabins." Perfect, I thought, I'm in the right place. After a short wait, I spotted a figure in the gift shop where I was standing, who just arrived, dressed in a brown and green uniform. It was Bill, a big man with thick white hair, broad shoulders, and a husky voice. He reminded me of a football coach. "Sorry to keep you," he said. "I was changing out of my soldier's clothes. I was doing a reenactment for a school group. Let's hop in my car." It was a late November afternoon, but Bill assured me we would get in as much of the tour as possible before evening set in. We climbed into his white SUV just as it began to drizzle and wove through the park's serpentine byways. "This area was originally established by Quakers in the 1740s, Bill told me. They founded the Mountjoy Forge here and formed a small industrial community. Over time, they expanded the ironworks and built mills and houses. The surrounding acreage was rich farmland for growing wheat, Indian corn, hay, and rye. Washington's quartermaster Thomas Mifflin scouted this area near the Schuylkill River and decided it was a good place to camp because it was secluded between two hills. Our first stop was a row of log cabins. These were built by the soldiers themselves on Washington's orders," Bill said. "There was prize money for the best ones. Construction began immediately upon arrival at the camp on December 19, 1777, because the troops had no barracks to sleep in and winter had set in. The men had grown up on farms in New England, so they knew how to build things. They made the chimneys out of wood because it was too labor-intensive to make stone ones. Originally, there were hundreds of these cabins," Bill said, "in long rows. We have 10 replicas on display." We entered one of the cabins. A fire was crackling on the hearth. I eyed the bunk beds and the dirt floor. The room was dark and damp. The exposed walls were caked with mud and straw to keep out the draft. There were no windows. Poor air circulation, I learned, led to stuffy, often foul-smelling places that were ripe for spreading disease. "You can imagine how many trees were cut down for these cabins," Bill went on. "They were built to house some 11,000 soldiers. There were about 12 men per cabin, each about 14 by 16 size. They also needed wood to keep the bake ovens running. There were thousands of loaves of bread needed to feed the soldiers each day." He spoke passionately about the history of Valley Forge. The rebel army had been in dire need of basic necessities like blankets, he said, and the desertion rate was close to 20%. He talked about the meager rations, often just watery soup made from bone marrow. Sometimes the men boiled fat. I hope your dinner this evening will be a little better than that. In 2019, Bill had been working at Valley Forge for 27 years. "I was a high school teacher for 10 years before that," he said. "It takes a lot of training to be a ranger. The National Parks requires us, in addition to our history education, to be peace officers. That means instructions on using firearms, driving emergency vehicles, and arrest techniques. In between my hours here, though, I'm writing a book on Benjamin Franklin. I have a couple of chapters left." Back in the car, we continued on our tour. Our next stop was George Washington's headquarters, a fieldstone building with white trim, characteristic of the Delaware Valley. Bill pointed out the flag in front, a replica that had 13 stars, one for each of the colonies. This was one of the first flags of the new republic, he said. In front of this house, there would have been Washington's elite guards assigned to protect him, he said. There were about 50 of them, kind of like the Secret Service today. You needed a password before they let you in. Our final destination was a bronze statue, this one of a man in a long cloak and hat who's standing atop a stone pedestal. Baron van Steuben, Bill said. He was an unsung hero of the revolution. He was a former officer in the Prussian War. Some question whether he was an actual baron, but regardless, he had a lot of experience in military maneuvers and drills and had written a manual on the subject. He was hired to teach the ragtag troops how to get in shape. By the time the Americans left Valley Forge for good in June 1778, the soldiers had been transformed into a disciplined army, he told me. Come back again December 19th, Bill said. That's when we do a reenactment of the army entering the camp on that same date in 1777. I dress up sometimes, but not every year. I'm getting a bit old for this kind of stuff. I know my time is coming because a third grader came up to me the other day and asked if I'd ever met George Washington. Can you believe it? I said no, but I did know Thomas Jefferson. Thank you. I'd be glad to answer any questions if anyone has them. Feel free, I'm very willing. There's a question over there.
And I'm going to ask if you would wait till the microphone comes to you before you ask your question.
Thank you for a very informative talk. Out of curiosity, why did Rochambeau think that Washington shouldn't go and try to get back to New York and instead go to Yorktown? Was there any military logic?
Well, he felt that they really didn't have the ships to combat the British ships in New York Harbor, and it was really going to be a lost cause to deal with that lack of Navy. And he knew that Cornwallis was backed up in the Chesapeake in a spot where he was set up in Yorktown, that they thought they had a real chance. It was actually a siege, not so much a battle. Unfortunately, you might imagine what's happening in the Ukraine. It was a siege to wear them out, and they finally gave up. Cornwallis refused to use the word surrender in the negotiations. He thought it was too demoralizing. They came up with a compromise. I forgot what the word is. That was a stickling point. That was one of the reasonings behind it. And to Washington's credit, he listened to Rochambeau and vice versa. There was a mutual respect. We don't know all the details. Rochambeau did not speak a word of English. It had to be done through translation. But Rochambeau was given instructions that he respect this officer, even though Rochambeau had 12 last names, was a major aristocrat and a distinguished soldier. And Washington, who was he, right? Just a colonial general. But they were able to work together, I'm sure not always easily, but it's an interesting relationship. I'm sure there's several books on it. It's a long answer to your question. There was another.
My question is more about your working habits. Do you do sketches and then work from the sketches in the studio to do the paintings? And
Yes.
Secondly, do you ever do sketches on iPads or colored paintings on iPads? I've been reading about David Hockney. He's doing all kinds of things on iPads now.
No, I'm not an iPad guy. I was going to show you the evidence. I still have a flip phone. This would have been, it's signed by George Washington. At Yale, there's a group of professors we call the flip phone club. We all have flip phone. No, I didn't use any of that. I tended, depending on the weather and the amount of time I had at a given site, sometimes I could do a full-fledged watercolor on site and set up shop. I've learned to paint quickly in those kind of situations. Sometimes I resorted to sketches because I may not have had that much time, or it was raining, and watercolor and rain don't mix so well. And sometimes I had to go back another time to do it, but I like to work on plein air and to capture that moment. I think I touched on two different ways that I like to paint. One, working on the white paper, which is a more traditional method now. The more traditional method 100 years ago was to work off of a already colored background, which you can do with colored paper. But if you know about painting, oil paintings up until 1930 or whatever the year was with modern art really took hold, artists did a so-called ground of another color, a neutral color in the background, and worked off of that. So I've applied that to watercolor and teach my students how to do that as well. A little bit antiquated, but I think it has interesting effects, as you've seen in some of these. Was there another question?
Well, we have an online question.
Oh.
Are there any historic sites in Yorktown open to the public? This is from Lydia online.
Yes, it's mentioned in the book. There is a national park at Yorktown, which has various buildings and museum related stuff that you can visit. So that is certainly a destination. And you can always do those other areas in Virginia, Mount Vernon, James Madison's house, and Thomas Jefferson's house. So it's a full trip. And Williamsburg, of course, is in Virginia. Another question from the audience?
So you got me pretty excited about something that I knew nothing about, which is 3 Cherry Street as the first White House with Washington. And then I did a quick Google, so they moved to 39 Broadway as for a bigger place. But we don't often, and with America 250 coming up, think of New York as really a centerpiece for the beginning.
Yes.
And particularly that Washington really was here very much, even though it was important. So I want to ask you the question, of course, you brought it up. How significant, I mean, it really was significant in a lot of ways that New York was a centerpiece for the beginning of the country.
Yes, well, it's huge and not always fully recognized for whatever reason. You know, we don't get that much history, even in my time in high school, but they tend to focus on Bunker Hill, Lexington and Concord, the crossing of the Delaware, and somehow things like the Battle of Brooklyn or Long Island, depending how you refer to it, is not always spoken about, I guess partly because it was a major defeat against the Americans. So if we have our own version of propaganda, we gloss over that. That was actually the largest battle of the war with the most people involved. And I touch on in the book, that could have very well been the end. But if you know this miraculous story that Washington escaped in the middle of the night with his soldiers on rowboats across from Brooklyn to across the East River to Manhattan and lived another day. Yes, there's so much history in New York. There's the Morris Juvenile Mansion. Does anyone know that? The oldest house in Manhattan, supposedly. And that's also somewhat restored, not as much as some of these others. But that's where Washington had his headquarters. But Washington and his men were able to set up shop outside of lower Manhattan, but the British occupied that area, which was really basically the city for the duration of the war.
So I just wanted to follow up because it's really interesting. You could, with President's Day, George Washington was almost forgotten in terms of the recognition. And young people today don't know much about Washington. In fact, he's being discussed more in terms of slavery and how we should look at it. It seems to me there's an opportunity. We just started celebrating Evacuation Day, you know, a number of years ago. It seems like there's an opportunity to bring back Washington to New York out of what you're saying, which I bet you 99% of the people here have no idea.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I considered myself one of those. You associate him with Virginia so much and his estate, and or you would have thought he passed through New York, but you didn't realize how much time he spent here between Morris Juvenile and, of course, the first White House. But it's that was a pivotal point, partly because it was near the Hudson. They were trying to deal with that access point. If you owned the Hudson, you were able to control the war. Up and down through Canada and here was where the British were trying to separate us as a colony so that they could take advantage of that and break it into two. And that was the chain fence, the chain link across the river was so important. But New York City, of course, was that entry point. So it had a lot of significance. And I think at one point, Washington was thinking of burning, I should get this right, so double check it. One of them, British or the Americans, were going to burn New York City altogether. And they luckily didn't. But rather than leave them to the British, they could use the shops and the restaurants. And they thought, let's just burn it on the way out. They can't take advantage of it. But luckily, they didn't do that. Yeah, there's tremendous history here. And more than I touched on even was the,
Adam, yeah,
go ahead.
yes. So over here.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you. In just one quick thing about the plaque you asked about, that was to celebrate the 200th anniversary, birthday of George Washington, and it was erected by the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and that's the plaque that you saw on the way in.
Okay.
And the other thing I wanted to say was in terms of a question. So, well, first of all, thank you for the great gift that you've given us in terms of your work that will make us be thinking of our founding fathers and that we should be so grateful to and are. But I want, when you, the fact that you draw these images, you paint, how can you share your mind what's going on? Because it has to be the deepest of connections you're making with what you're writing about. So if you could just share
I'm
that.
sorry if I'm getting the proper question. You want me to talk about?
Well, you're as you're
You mean
painting.
the writing mind versus the painting mind? Or?
You could cover both and just how that, because it's very special, the fact that you.
Right.
paint all
Well,
the
I can tell
illustrations.
you, maybe it's a roundabout answer to your question. The aim of my essays were not to be just historical essays, because of course that has been covered so much. So I thought, how do you make this interesting? And I tried to do it a little bit, in some cases, the variations, like a reporter. In this case, I chose to focus on the ranger in that Valley Forge thing. I could have gone another way and just referenced him briefly. I thought that's a story, that he represents a whole story about what it be a national park ranger. I thought he was colorful and interesting, and people don't know about him. So I thought he could be the storyteller in this particular thing. I tried to mix it up kind of like a talk of the town piece in the New Yorker, kind of a breezy style where I brought in some scholars, sometimes a park ranger, sometimes a colorful couple of characters who gave us a tour. A friend of mine and me gave a tour of the Staten Island house. They were something else. Volunteers, wonderful older couple. And I integrated them into it. And as I say, more erudite scholars as well, I consulted. So that was my thinking. But it is an interesting idea to write and paint a site to really get a full scale appreciation for it on many levels. It's also, for those of you who might do both, or at least one, it is a split brain thing, because at least for me, they're very different ways of thinking and doing. And I must say, I've been studying painting and drawing since I was very young. Writing came more later in my life. So I can actually do the drawing and painting fairly quickly. The writing takes a long time. And it's the irony of irony. You're supposed to sound like it's simple and you just rattle it off. But of course, there's so much effort involved in that. But I can do a painting and then put it aside and I'm done. When I'm writing, I'm lying in the middle of my sleep thinking, well, if I change that word to that word, or, you know, should I put a semicolon there? I mean, it just goes on forever. So I'm sure there are many writers in the room who know that. Anyway, it was a challenge, but hopefully I succeeded. Another question?
Thank you. Is there a distinction to be made between the war for independence and the American Revolution?
The War of Independence, and how do you mean?
Well, I think the war has fixed dates you could place on them. An historian made this remark to me once and didn't explain it fully, but he was quite convinced that there was, can you place a date beginning and end of the American Revolution as opposed to the war, which has
Oh, yes. Well,
fixed
I
dates?
guess I actually have an elaborate timeline in here. which I should reference because I put it down several months ago before the book was published. But it talks about those earlier days when it was brewing with, of course, the Stamp Act and other things, that a good 10 or 15 years of slow development leading to what eventually would be a full-out war. But it was growing, and when you understand these things, it's kind of fascinating because you say to yourself, what was the real problem here? I mean, the British were 3,000 miles away. They didn't have a standing army all over the place. They had soldiers. I mean, it wasn't so bad being an American under British rule. What did they get so upset about? Again, simplifying history. But the founding fathers very strongly about that independence of voting on issues and having a superior role in decision-making that wasn't relegated to Parliament, even though they did have representation in the House of Burgesses in Virginia and other places. They were very adamant about the principle of this, as Thomas Payne really fueled the fire for as well. He was actually a great spokesman for these founding fathers in articulating this in a way that others could appreciate it. But it's very interesting because they could have gone along their merry way. Things were not so bad. In fact, British soldiers at the Battle of Long Island, when they headed on to Brooklyn, or parts of Queens, whatever it would be now, they remarked how astounded they were that the farmhouses that they, in some cases, raided food or maybe other things as they passed through Brooklyn were in such good condition, well furnished, better than their own soldiers' lives and homes in Britain. And they had no idea. I'm maybe again a stretch of comparison, but you know, it's from what you read, the Russian soldiers seem to be brainwashed about the Ukrainians being lesser beings or so forth. Perhaps it was similar for the British, but they were astounded. But then you think about it, these farmers or people who lived in places like Brooklyn, in America was already settled, 1630s, 40s, albeit by the Dutch and others, for already 100, 125 years. It's a long time to build nice homes and to develop the land. So it's not surprising, but if you didn't know that, it was shocking to, but all this tying back to the Americans were living pretty well. And so it's a bit of a mystery on some level as to why they even got this revolution started. But you have to remember, there were a lot of people who had no interest in this. They thought their lives were fine. John Adams summarized this in a letter to Abigail or somebody else, I can't remember, that he said there's about 1/3 that are rabid patriots, there's 1/3 that are loyalists, and 1/3 that are sort of undecided. So it wasn't all these soldiers running up and flags draped around them and ready to fight the cause. I don't want to diminish the bravery of many of them, but there were a lot of these soldiers that were in the Continental Army that were desperate. They were recent immigrants. They had none of these nice farmhouses in Brooklyn or Staten Island. They needed a buck, and they were, many of them, down and out. And this was a way to sustain themselves. And in fact, some of them were so adamant that they would only do this just for a short stint, make a few dollars and go on, that there was a mild mutiny, and it didn't materialize, but it started. It could have been more significant. The Philadelphia Regiment and the Pennsylvania Regiment around the Philadelphia campaigns decided to revolt because they thought they had 1 year on their contract and then they could go home. They didn't apparently read the fine print, or maybe it wasn't so clearly written. They were supposed to stay to the end of the war. And that really, they had no interest in that. So there was a lot of issues at play. Our narrative likes to be about a certain more glorious, what's the word, patriotism. But there's some realities too that are important to note. And They weren't well trained, as I said, they weren't established soldiers. Washington was, I wouldn't say horrified, maybe he was, when he set up quarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when he got his first group of Continental armies, and he saw what hopeless soldiers these were. They couldn't even get their act together. You know, they weren't well trained. And he thought, what am I going to do with these people? He wrote in these letters, I can't fight with these men. He persevered, and with the help of von Steuben and Valley Forge, to get them up to speed. But it was a challenge. Another question?
Actually, sorry, Tom, just I want to take some of the online questions before that. And then we'll take, I know we're sort of running, going to be running over time, but I know there's a gentleman over there who had a question. So I'll answer I'll present the online questions, and 3 of them are actually about Lafayette. So if I can fuse them together, okay? Okay. So the first one was about, this is more a comment. Couldn't we say that Lafayette was more interested in a republic than a democracy? That's from Frederick. Were Lafayette and Steuben paid by the government, by their government, for their services? And finally, I live in the Hudson River Valley, says Rena. We have often heard that Lafayette carved his initials in the window frame at the Beekman at Rhinebeck. Have you heard this tale?
Well, these are wonderful questions, and I wish I had good answers for all of them. I don't know about the Beekman. I can at least say, if this book inspires people to explore that, including myself, I would like to check on that, and I don't know the answer. I think you could say republic might have been more what he was thinking, the democracy, and whether he was paid that much, I don't know exactly. He was involved earlier than the whole French alliance that came over, so he was very early in the game. I was going to mention something about that, but it slipped my mind. I'll try to remember.
Well, it was a treble barrel question, so
Yeah.
yes. So, okay, well, actually, I'm going to take Tom's, just because I'm beside Tom, and then I'll come over to you, sir, and then that will conclude the questions for tonight.
So I just wanted to address a couple of points that have been brought up. The Sons of Liberty started in 1766, which was the gentleman in Massachusetts and New York was very active with Sons of Liberty,
right.
Who maybe at that point were already foreseeing the future, where, like you were saying, a third of the country had no interest in that.
Yes.
But the other thing is, we were talking about the Battle of Brooklyn, where the war could have ended there. You had Admiral Howe and his brother General Howe. Both of them were relatively sympathetic to the American colonists not wanting a bloodbath here. And in Staten Island, when they met with Benjamin Franklin, he was really trying to say, let's just stop this before it gets out of control. And they were not.
What do they call it? An exit ramp or something?
Right. And the other, when we were talking about the Battle of Brooklyn, it was actually Gloucestershire fishermen from Gloucester, Massachusetts, that miraculously got the army from Brooklyn over to Manhattan, and also the same men that crossed the Delaware to attack the Hessians in in New
Glover.
Jersey.
Admiral Glover.
John
Yes.
Glover. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a story, a wonderful
Yeah.
story.
So I just wanted to throw.
No,
in
I'm
those
glad
things
you
I did
brought
there.
that up as a reminder, because in the middle of the night, he's suddenly getting Glover to get these rowboats from all the local farmers so he can transport his men. He didn't plan for this, maybe in the back of his mind in an emergency, that what would I do? But it's hard to know, but they pulled it off. The miraculous story is supposedly, it took longer than he thought. The East River is very choppy as opposed to the other side. It was taking longer than they thought. It was getting actually too light, and the British were all in the harbor. They could see this going on if it gets too light. The story goes that a fog mysteriously developed and blocked a lot of the view of those early hours when sunlight was coming up, and Washington was able to escape. They even set up a few people on the Brooklyn side to set up campfires as a decoy to make them think they were still there. But to touch on your point, a lot of the British, you have to remember, they fought with the Americans in the French and Indian War. So they did have sympathies. And of course, they're British people. They all speak the same language. So if you give them some slack, because people have said, armchair quarterbacks, is that what we call it now? why didn't they wipe out Washington's camp that night and just call it a day? They had wounded and killed many of the Americans. Why is Howe sleeping and Washington sleeping and letting him get away? Well, as you said, as I was talking, the fellow British soldiers, I don't know if the plan was to annihilate their own people. I think they thought they made a statement, you know, and this isn't our role. So maybe they were naive, but it's hard to know. They put a huge campaign in the beginning with all these ships to basically make a statement. One and done, this is over, we're going to scare the hell out of you. They put so many ships and so many men. But the resolve, well, this was what happens when you fight on native soil, right? People have tremendous courage. You're seeing that. Again, I don't want to make too many comparisons with Ukraine because it's very complicated, but you're seeing a version of that on some level. You don't expect people to rise to that level, but when you're on your own turf, it does things. And the morale isn't as high for the British, but I think it was a sign of, what's the word, empathy maybe of Howe and giving them that olive branch. You know, they had their motives. They wanted to go home to the fancy cakes and ale back in Britain and not be stuck over here. The houses weren't as great compared to what they lived in. So there's enough to go around, but they certainly gave them a way out. One little story that reminds me, I don't want to get too far over, but a little sub-story that's quite remarkable about one of these British generals. Does anyone know the name Johnny Burgoyne? The Battle of Saratoga. He was the British officer that lost what was supposed to be a slam dunk. And that was the turning point of the war in the middle of the revolution, because when the French saw that we were able to beat the British at Saratoga, they just brought the money in. But he was such persona non grata after that, that he was a forgotten man for the rest of his life. No one had anything to do with him. So that's the plight. What? Yes. Was there one question online or is that the, oh.
I'm curious as to how Washington and the founding fathers showed their gratitude to the French when all the dust settled.
That's a good question. You know, we have this great monument of the Statue of Liberty. Years later, the French gave to us. I wonder what we did over there. I'd have to look into that. And maybe I'm forgetting a sidebar that, not answering your question, but reminds me, Benjamin Franklin was the secret weapon of the revolution because he spent the entire duration of the war in Paris. You think he was here because he's a founding father. He was there cajoling, manipulating, persuading the French to join and help make that alliance because he was such a charismatic character. I think Adams went over there and was jealous. The French all loved Franklin, but he wasn't here. And you might say, oh, well, he didn't want to be here. Who would want to be here in the midst of the fight? But he served a major role in that alliance. But I don't know the specific gratitude touchstones. I should look that up. Is that?
That.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. You are all excellent students. I will give you a grade later. If you would like, I'm going to go back to that desk and be happy to sign my John Hancock, as they say, signature. But before we do that, you're going to.
I am just going to take an opportunity to thank you publicly for just a really fabulous lecture. Your incredible knowledge about the Revolutionary War, then combined with the exquisite and your gorgeous drawings. I mean, it was so informative, the talk. And I also speak as a non-American. I learned so much tonight. So thank you very much for that. I do want to mention that Adam's book, I'm going to reinforce that Adam, what an opportunity to get this gorgeous book. What, if not for you, what a fabulous gift. So this will be, you'll be able to get a signed copy from Adam. And to conclude the night, we're going to have a few words from our executive director, Victoria Dengel. Oh, and please join us for a glass of wine. And then he forgot.
And I'll keep it brief. Adam, thank you for an elegant reflection on our founding fathers. And we look to them with gratitude. And I'd like to say at this time that the General Society each year reads the Declaration of Independence and in its entirety, and we've been doing that continuously since 1793. And we will convene later in the month and in this room and read it once more. So God bless America, and thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
And finally, we would just like to make a small presentation to Adam. I think Adam knows it's coming. Victoria, would you like to present this?
Thank you.
It's the poster. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our online audience, and thank you to our in-person audience. And please now, in addition to purchasing a book, please join us for a glass of wine. Our next lecture is on the 12th of July and will be about landmarks of the meat packing district. So I hope you can join us then. Thank you very much. Good night.